Hi, this is Mr. Chandler. Today we're going to talk about Standard 1.4, the Articles of Confederation. Remember, our last unit was on the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. So today we're going to talk about the government of the new country that was established by those two things. That government was based off of a document called the Articles of Confederation. The problem with it is there's a lot of dissatisfaction over it because it doesn't really work all that well. And those dissatisfactions are going to lead to the writing of the Constitution. And that's the Constitution that we know of today that our government's based off of. And so in that process, we're going to talk about some of the debates and compromises at the convention and then how that Constitution was approved. It's not a great form of government. It was a start, though, but it wasn't a great form of government. The biggest problem and the thing you really need to understand about the Articles of Confederation was that it created a very, very weak government that couldn't meet the needs of the nation. And they have a reason for that. If you think back to before the Declaration of Independence, they thought that the British government was too strong and was oppressing the colonies. And so they made sure to create this very, very weak national government so that it wouldn't oppress the state governments. And so during the war, what they thought that the power rested in their state governments. That's what sovereignty means, power. And so they developed a confederation of the 13 states. So what it is an alliance. It's almost like South Carolina is its own country, North Carolina is its own country, but they're banded together in an alliance called the United States. They're not really all part of one big country called the United States yet. It's not very effective. Almost immediately, they don't really accomplish all that much because of all the competing state interests. That the states just can't get along, and there's no national government to lead them and tell them what to do. There are some successes of the Articles of Confederation, and it had to do with land claims. And this had to do a lot of large states versus small states. As we start getting land westward of us, the question is who's going to control that? The states that were right next to that land thought that they would get it. Meanwhile, you have states like South Carolina, which don't really have a chance to get that land because North Carolina and Georgia basically block us from all that new territory. And so what it's going to do is they create a compromise where the western lands are going to go to the Confederation government. And the Confederation government is going to control those lands. And the way they set up new territories is through the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance. One of the big victories is that slavery was actually declared illegal in the Northwest Territory. This is one of the first acts of the first Congress of the new Constitution. And so what it does is it creates a new states on equal footing with the original states. And that's an achievement of the Confederation government, that we're going to be able to create new states as opposed to states just growing larger geographically. Not all founders are happy with this. And that's going to create a little bit of problems. And so some of the new states are going to be much weaker. It was also an effective form of government during the Revolutionary War. And that's because they all had a common cause. They were all trying to win a war. So they all were more willing to agree since they had this common cause. Whenever that common ground is gone, though, they're not going to be willing to agree with each other. It's also effective on the state levels because states wrote new constitutions and passed laws that met their needs. Although it's not good for the government, the national government as a whole. They also are able to negotiate the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution. Now we need to discuss the problems of the Articles of Confederation and how the Constitution tried to fix that. The economy, one of the problems was that trade with Britain was interrupted because we just fought a war with them. They're not going to trade with us. So after independence, would Britain keep trading with us? Of course not. So it's going to lead to an economic depression, and that's going to be a very big challenge to the Confederation government. Some people cannot pay their mortgages, their state taxes, which is going to lead to a very famous rebellion in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion, which is going to lead to the Constitution being written and the Articles of Confederation being thrown out. Shays' Rebellion is what leads to that. Farmers were having their farms foreclosed on by the banks, and they were unable to pay, and so they were getting their land taken, and they were getting upset about that, and so there's this call for rebellion. That's going to make the rich people in the colonies worried because they're worried that the national government, the Confederation, is not strong enough to put down the rebellion. And so that fear is going to cause them to want to start writing the Constitution. Because remember, the Confederation government's not going to be able to pay for an army because one of the big problems is they can't tax, which I'll get to in a minute. And so they decided to send delegates to Philadelphia to revise the Articles. But when they went to revise it, they realized that Rhode Island didn't show up, so they couldn't revise it because they needed all 13 states to revise it. So they had to just write a new one. Like I said, one of the big problems was the Confederation government could not tax. And so under the new Constitution, they fixed that problem by giving the national government the power to levy taxes. The states also have that power. That's why whenever you work, you're taxed by both the national government and the state government. The Confederation government could not resolve conflicts between the states over trade between them. In fact, I believe Georgia and South Carolina actually almost went to war. Currency, boundary, none of those could be solved by the national government. The power was not recognized by the states, and there's no judicial branch to resolve conflicts. And so at the Philadelphia Convention, when they write the Constitution, the national government's given the exclusive power to control interstate trade, meaning state trade between two states, and to control currency. And they also make a judicial branch to resolve conflicts. The Confederation government also could not force the British to abide by the Treaty of Paris. They just were too weak. In fact, the British refused to leave their forts on the Great Lakes. We couldn't get rid of them. Our army, we couldn't pay our army to be able to get them, to be able to move them up to the British and kick them out. And we couldn't persuade the British to continue trade with the United States because, like I said, we just fought a war with them. Notice how the inability to fund a standing army and continue trade with Britain had both an economic and a diplomatic consequence. We also couldn't persuade the Spanish to give us access to the port of New Orleans, which is a very important port because that's where the Mississippi River goes through, and Mississippi River is the biggest river in the United States, and a lot of trade flows down it. And so it's going to, again, hurt our economics, hurt our trade, and so the Confederation can't solve that. And so instead of the national government trying to negotiate with foreign powers, we have states trying to do it separately. And since states think that they have all the power, that's why they do that. They all have different interests and needs, and so it doesn't really work very well. There can be 13 different trade deals with countries rather than one as a whole country, and that can be a problem. The biggest problem, like I said, is the inability to levy taxes. They can only request funds from the state. That's like them coming to South Carolina and asking, hey, we want some money, and South Carolina's going to go, no, of course I'm not going to give you any money. So they have to have that power. The national government has to have that power to tax. Even if we don't necessarily like being taxed, they have to be able to tax in order to fund government programs. To fix these problems, the new Constitution gave the national government the exclusive right to make treaties with foreign powers, and it strengthened the United States' interests diplomatically. They were also able to tax. Southern states were really worried that that's going to cause the national government to ban the slave trade, which is then going to hurt them economically because they won't be able to get slaves, which slaves is what really makes the cash crops profitable, having a free labor source. And they do end up getting rid of the slave trade. The biggest problem of the Confederation government was its inability to solve national problems. The states refused to acknowledge the authority and power of the central government. Every problem I mentioned comes down to this. And so the Constitution fixed this by creating a federal system in which power is shared by states and national government. That's what federalism means. It's shared powers between the state and national government. That's what we have. We have a federalist system. The obvious solution was to fix the Articles of Confederation. However, it takes all 13 to be able to make a change. And since Rhode Island didn't even show up, they're not going to be able to amend it. So what they decided to do was to create a new constitution where you only need 3/4 of the states to amend it as opposed to all of them. That's not easy, but it's also not impossible. The structure of the Confederation government is there's no executive branch, there's no president, so there's no one to carry out the will of the National Congress. There's no judicial branch to negotiate problems and to solve those problems. And so the Constitution establishes 3 branches of government. The legislative, which is Congress, the executive, which is the president, and judicial, which is the court systems. And each has its own powers. And they also have checks and balances over each other so that they don't gain too much power. Congress passes the laws, then the president can veto it. Congress can then overturn that veto, and then the Supreme Court can also declare acts of Congress and the president to be unconstitutional. So they all have power over each other. The Confederation Congress was unicameral, and each state had one vote, regardless of population of the state. This set up an important debate and compromise at the Philadelphia Convention. The large states wanted it to be based off of population, because then they would have more representation, while the small states wanted it to be equal, because then they would all be equal, and the small states would actually have more power, even though they had less people. What they agree on, and this is so important, is they agreed on a bicameral system. That means two, where the Senate is the upper house, and each state gets 2 votes. Each state has 2 senators, while the House of Representatives is based off of population. For instance, South Carolina has 7 representatives, while California has 50-something representatives. The Great Compromise is going to set up the next debate, and it's about how slaves are going to be counted. And what they agree to is that slaves are going to count as 3/5 of a person, and that's going to count towards the state tax as well as representation for the House of Representatives. Sovereignty, they agreed that sovereignty would lie with the people. That means the power. The power lies with the people. The government gets its power to rule because of us. We give them the power. That's why the Constitution says, we the people. Who rules? We do. We make the decisions. And that kind of goes back to the whole no taxation with representation and to the idea of the Magna Carta. They were worried about the people having too much power and the people not being smart enough to make good decisions, especially during elections. So that's why they created the Electoral College to elect the president. They're worried the people weren't smart enough to do it. So instead, what the Electoral College does is we elect people who then go make the decision for us on who's going to be president. Now today, it almost always turns out that whoever we vote for as a state, that's who the electors vote for. But it's still done this way. Senators are also appointed by the state legislatures. That's going to change during the populist era. And that's another indirect election because they're afraid the people wouldn't be smart enough to make the decisions. And so they think the senators should be appointed by the state legislatures who are thought of as being smarter. And then the Supreme Court is nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. And that's part of the system of checks and balances. The form of government we have today, it didn't just happen. It wasn't an accident. It was not an experiment. The Articles was an experiment and it failed. The Constitution really fixes those problems from the Articles, and it has a lot to do with our previous rights, from the Magna Carta, the rule of law, the Bill of Rights, and some of the Enlightenment thinkers of the time. And there are a lot of compromises that take place at that Constitutional Convention. The Constitution is ratified. It took 9 of 13 states to ratify, as opposed to unanimous approval for the Articles. And so eventually it's going to take a while, but it's going to be approved. And all of them are eventually going to approve it. It's going to take a little while for Rhode Island to approve it, but most of the rest will do it quickly. There are 2 groups. There are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are the ones who supported the Constitution, while the Anti-Federalists were against it. And really the biggest controversy is the fact that there's no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And so they reach a compromise that they'll put a Bill of Rights in, which will be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, as long as they will ratify it. They used the Federalist Papers as a series of essays to help convince people to vote for the Constitution. Those are some people who wrote them: James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay. And they're really written to influence New York to ratify, because New York had to ratify, or else it wouldn't have as much power as it should. And it's very important today because it helps us understand what the people who wrote the Constitution were thinking when they wrote it. Thank you very much for watching. Please go to the video quiz on Edmodo for 1.4, and remember to bring in your completed notes guide to class. Thank you very much. Let me know if you have any questions.